Hi, everybody. Welcome. I appreciate so much you're all being here today. This is just very special to me that to have this party after a dozen years of this book in the making, and very special to me that you all could come. Uh, I want to especially thank my children for being here, Brett and Barbara and their children, and Sky and Ian, and also Karen and Kara and Caroline. I don't see where they are. Right here. There they are. And their beautiful little daughter, Caroline. And let's see. And unfortunately, Sandy couldn't be here. She has a good friend who just passed away yesterday, so she had to be there. They're having a little bit of a get together right at this time. And Scott is off in Colorado, so he was not able to be here. Can you all hear me? Yeah. And you can hear me inside?
Perfectly well.
Okay, good. So I'd like to also especially thank Ruth Herman. So Ruth, you have to come out so you can say hello to people.
Hello, people.
Ruth is my editor, and it was a huge, enormous help. I'm indebted to her for all of her help along the way, both in the writing of the book and also in the publishing of it. So I wanted to thank her, and then and this is Ken, my new sweetheart. And I can't tell you how helpful he's been, how supportive he's been, and he couldn't ask for a better partner. So just to tell you a few words about why I wrote this book. When Ted died, I really didn't see how I could ever possibly be really happy again. When you've lost the most important person in your world and the most essential ingredient in your life, it's hard to imagine that you could ever be truly joyful again. And I thought, he wore large shoes, size 13 shoes, so I didn't see how I could ever anybody fill those shoes again. And he, when he died, it left such a void in my life that I didn't see how it could be done. But I'm not a person to coast to the end, and so I read like I've done most of my life. I went to the library, went to bookstores, and I got out every book I could find written by other widows and widowers, and I just wanted to see what kind of magic could I learn from what they had gone through. What had they done to make a good life for themselves again? And I did find it helpful. And so along the way, I started to keep a journal of what I was going through, and then I thought, well, I can leave this for my grandchildren, who someday might have someone truly special that they lost. And I thought, when my grandfather died, my grandmother, I just wondered what she had gone through when the love of her life had died. And so I thought this could be helpful to my grandchildren someday. So one thing led to another, and the book kind of grew, and here we are today. Although I have to say that the process of writing was very helpful in itself. It was very therapeutic just to go to the bookstore, actually go to Panera, go to Starbucks if I had a couple hours free at lunchtime, and I just read and I wrote and I read and I wrote, and it was helpful. It was very helpful. So that's how I got started writing the book. So let me just tell you a little bit how the book is organized. There's 4 parts to it. The first part is titled Gone. It's the acute phase of grief that I went through, and when my feelings were most raw. And then there's the second part of the book is called Going On, and it was putting one foot in front of the other, but this is, alone, without my husband with me. And then the third part was called Mystical Encounters. This was when I had a number of inexplicable synchronistic events that happened along the way, and they were really strange and bizarre, but also strangely comforting. And so this third part is about these inexplicable synchronistic, for lack of a better way of defining them, I call them that. And then the fourth part of the book is the spiritual part, and then I wrote a little epilogue at the end. So let us go to the beginning of the end, that is. Reading from the first chapter, the first lines of the book. July 14th, 2001, just a normal day, a day like any other summer day. Ted and I started off the morning in our usual manner with a cup of coffee in bed. I loved waking up with my husband this way, lying propped up on an assortment of pillows, sipping our coffee, holding hands, and talking about our day ahead. So on this particular day, Ted was going to go off and row in a sculling race. I usually went with him to cheer him on, but this particular day I had another commitment and I couldn't go with him. After he left, I went off to do some grocery shopping, and I had just returned home and was walking in the door carrying 2 big bags of fruit and vegetables from the local farm stand when I heard the phone ringing. "There's been an accident on the river," the innocuous-sounding voice began. "Your husband has had a heart attack." And with those words, my world turned upside down. I was suddenly thrown into a surreal nightmare of an existence. Many of you have been there, I know, where you have to go off to the hospital to identify his body, go to the river and retrieve his boat and personal belongings, call my children, which is the hardest phone calls I've ever made in my life. And then I called Helen Cohen. Where's Helen Cohen? She's in there. I called Helen, and she dropped everything, and she was over in a half an hour, and we began planning a memorial service. Ted and I had never really talked much about what to do after our deaths. I'm reading from a chapter called Scattering the Remains. Ted and I never talked about much what to do after our deaths. We had never looked into buying a cemetery plot. All I knew was that he wanted to be cremated, but as far as anything else, the service, where to scatter his ashes, Ted just said that the wishes of the living should be honored, not the concerns of the person who was dead. So I had no idea what to do with him. A few days after he died, the mortuary had called and said I needed to choose the container I wanted for my husband's remains. To think my vibrant, robust, and so very alive husband had now been reduced to just a container of remains. What had become of his essence, his very aliveness? Was he simply gone, evaporated? But I've got a job to do, I said to myself. I can't be wondering about these things now. After much thought and discussion, my children and I decided that we would scatter his ashes up on Mount Washington. Ever since Ted had been a young man in college, he had loved hiking its many trails and skiing the famous head wall. He had often said that he wanted to celebrate his 80th birthday by hiking up to the summit with any of our friends and family who could still join him. It seemed the natural thing to do was to take his ashes up there. Sadly, he would only be able to be with us in spirit. All 4 of our children came home Columbus Day weekend to participate in the Mount Washington ceremony. We decided to camp at the base of the mountain and then hike up the trail until we found a good spot to scatter the ashes. As we packed up, it felt like we were preparing for a good old days Anderson camping trip, gathering our sleeping bags and tents, shopping for food, getting out the old camp stove, and all our hiking gear. Finally, we were all loaded up and ready to go. As we locked at the house and walked out to the camper, someone exclaimed, "Hey, we forgot Dad!" In our excitement, we'd forgotten to pack the urn. Scott carried the precious burden up the hill. The marble urn was heavy, and I was surprised at how heavy the ashes themselves were. I had suggested to Scott that we might repack the ashes to make his load lighter, but he insisted on carrying the whole thing as it was. This had to be a sad but tender experience for Scott, carrying his father on his back up the mountain, reminiscent of when he was a little boy and his dad had carried him on his back on many a hiking trip. We had just finished scattering his ashes when Sandy looked up and exclaimed, "There's a bear up on those rocks." As we looked more closely, this is right up at the Alpine Gardens part of Mount Washington, high above timberline. As we looked more closely, we saw a pair of bears high up on the mountain, just below the summit, ambling along on the rocky hillside. It's interesting. It's sometimes in the worst of times, there was an unusual event that happened. It was almost like a gift that helped to offset the terrible pain, like these two bears we saw on the mountainside. Also, I should mention that when he died and he capsized, when his boat turned upside down on the river, we heard that there was a double rainbow over the water. There was the first arc was high in the sky, and the second one was just resting on the water where he had gone down. In part 3, I talk about these inexplicable synchronistic events and other things that happened. Along the way, I've consulted 2 or 3 mediums and had some amazing experiences. I also experienced a number of very strange, bizarre electrical events that happened, which I don't understand, but it did happen. So I go into that more in detail in the Mystical Encounters section of the book. So time moves on, and one of the things that helped me most was joining bereavement groups. And then after a while, Judy Cole and I started our own group here with friends of ours from the church. And actually, they weren't all from the church. They were just friends of ours. And we still meet to this day and call ourselves the Good Grief Group. Nowhere do I feel more understood. We never hear those trite platitudes that attempt to slap a Band-Aid on a bleeding heart. Never expressed our veiled expectations that we should be over it by now. Like survivors of a shipwreck who've been thrown together on an unfamiliar shore, we find safety and comfort in one another. As we recognize our sadness and pain in each other, we also see mirrored our courage and resilience. When a fellow grieving widow says that she knows what you mean by hating Saturday nights, or hating coming home to the empty house, or feeling enraged when the garbage disposal becomes jammed and there's no husband to fix it, I know she knows what I know. Together we laugh, we cry, and we speak with an honesty that comes from having lost what mattered most. We have little use for facades or making nice. We share stories of heartache and envy when we see happy couples kissing on New Year's Eve or planning their retirement or the next vacation together. We try to remind ourselves of the wise words of Stephanie Erickson. To envy another's situation is only a way that we compare our insides to another's outsides. Over time, the focus of my reading changed. I went from reading books by other widows and widowers to reading books of more spiritual nature. I was curious about what happens after we die. And I know that a lot of the religions deal with this subject, this most mysterious part of life. So I wondered what I might find in the words of the masters. So I turned to books of a more spiritual nature. I read all kinds of books over quite a few years: Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Judaism, mysticism, and along the way, my exploration of these various religious beliefs took me down many random trails. I felt like one of my pioneer ancestors prospecting for gold, as I followed the vein of glitter up one stream bed and then another and another, until ultimately one day coming upon the mother lode from which they all had come. Each spiritual trail was interesting in its own right, as it branched out in various directions. But I was thrilled to discover that a single universal truth shines at the core of all major religions, and that is love. Practicing compassion is the thread running through the teachings of Confucius, Moses, Muhammad, the Buddha, and of course Jesus, who preached, "Love your enemies as yourself." They all teach us to look into our own hearts and discover what gives us pain, and then refuse, under any circumstances, to inflict that pain on anyone. Similarly, the liberal branches of the religion all speak of a spark of the divine that dwells within and animates all living beings. Christians call it Christ within, Buddhists call it Buddha nature or indwelling perfection. The Quakers speak of reading that of God in every person. The Kabbalists think of each person as a shard of the exploded God. Hindus call it Atman and say that at the core of everything stirs the hidden pulse of Brahman. One of the fascinating things I learned a lot along the way, but one of the things that was intriguing to me was the parallel between the religions of the world and individual people. On the surface, all the religions all look very different, and they argue and quarrel about which one is right and which one is correct and which one is best. And yet, at the core, they all believe the very similar things. And similarly, individual people, we all look very different on the surface, and yet at our core, at our center, we all want the same thing. We all want to love and be loved. We all want to be treated with dignity and respect. So over the years, I've done a lot of reading of various things spiritually, but I had an amazing experience, which I'll never forget. I call it a gift from a blind woman. This happened in the early days of after I'd lost Ted. I'm having one of those bad days, one of those days when I long for Ted so acutely that everything seems pointless, bleak. I cannot bear to go back to my lifeless house where emptiness hits me in the face when I step inside the door. So I take myself to Starbucks, to humanity. I find a seat by the window and insert myself into the bustle of life. People coming, people going, lovers meeting, friends happy and greeting, others engrossed in reading. The faint odor of coffee and rich pastries filters through my consciousness, arousing distant memories of home, being cared for. The warm cappuccino slides down my throat and soothes the ache in my chest. Clinking of spoons on coffee cups, clattering of dishes, soothes the ache in my chest. Clinking of spoons, and all of this happens against a background hum of voices. A balm for my shredded heart. I feel connected to life. I glance out the window, and the drab, slate gray sky reflects my desolate mood. A solitary raven holds vigil on a high wire, waiting. My eye settles on a lone figure, sitting on a bench, a blind woman. My attention awakens and is drawn to her. Sitting at her feet is a golden retriever guide dog, loyal, attentive, and quietly protective. I feel strangely bonded to her. As I watch, a man comes along, someone she seems to know. They sit together, share a bit of food, some conversation, and after a while he moves on. I'm struck by the very ordinariness of the event, a man and a woman coming together, a sharing, and then a moving apart. And yet, in the midst of this commonplace experience, something profound speaks to me. The woman, the dog, the man put me in touch with kindness, with compassion and strength. I feel her courage to live in the face of what must be tremendous obstacles and challenges. I feel humbled by her. I am taken out of my self-absorbed suffering, and I realize that many people live their lives with a disability or some other kind of intractable situation, and they do it so gracefully. All I have to do is open my eyes and look beyond my own pain. I can find myself in others and so be healed. I didn't just feel a connectedness to her, I felt a oneness with her. I am her, I thought. I am her isolation and her fear, and I am her courage as she faces darkness and the unknown. I am her appreciation of friendship, loyalty, and kindness. I look around me and realize that I can find myself everywhere. I am the little child across the coffee shop, kicking the table legs, beginning to fuss, unhappy and restless. I am the mother, feeling a rising frustration, but trying to hold it all together and be patient. I am the teenager in the midst of the group, clothed in black and decorated with piercings, feeling awkward and trying to fit in. I am those young lovers, oblivious to the world around them. Smitten by love, I am all these people. I have felt all these things at one or another time in my life. I am grateful to the blind woman. She threw me a lifeline that day. She took me out of my self-absorbed suffering and helped me feel not so alone. Indeed, I'm grateful for this entire journey. It opened me to life as I had not known it before. I thought I had finished my book, and then along came a most unexpected event. So I wrote the epilogue, titled Spiral of Grace. The song Amazing Grace has always been a favorite of mine. Earlier in the book, I had written about grace, how grace had touched my life on a number of momentous and life-changing occasions. Grace appears again. Nearly a dozen years after Ted's death, Grace appeared again. Just as magically as Ted had walked into my life, a new man appeared. Actually, Ted and I had known Ken and his wife, Louise, for more than 15 years through a tennis group we belonged to. Ken and his wife came to Ted's memorial service, and then when Louise died, I went to her service. As Ken was facing those dark times of his own early grief, he reached out to me in order to learn how I had dealt with the loss of a beloved spouse. One day we were having dinner. He paused, straightened his plate on his placemat, looked at me with his tender blue eyes and spoke. "You know, Cindy, I'm beginning to like you." I was stunned. I had not seen this coming. I was swept away by a rush of my own emotions. From that moment, I was smitten. Since I'd already had one love of my life, I didn't know it was possible to actually fall in love again. But I'm happy to tell you that yes, you can. And that is why I put the bumper sticker on the back of my car, Grace Happens. Until I reread the Cinderella story chapter of this book, I'd forgotten the dream I'd had years ago about trying shoes on potential romantic partners and not being able to find anyone who could wear Ted's size 13 shoes. Like Ted, Ken wears a size 13. Before I end, I want to tell you about an amazing dream I had shortly after Ken and I decided to buy our new home overlooking the pond. I was swimming alone and upstream. The going was tough. I pulled and pulled, stroke after stroke, struggling against the current. I couldn't tell if I was making any headway, but I just kept on going. There was no other choice. Sometimes the river flattened out, sometimes the water became turbulent, and the current became stronger. The air was getting colder, and before I knew it, the water had turned icy. Now I found myself swimming on top of the ice. Still doing the breaststroke, I kept pulling and pulling. I kept slowly sliding myself across the ice. I was becoming exhausted. I had just about reached my limit. And then in the distance, I began to see the sky brightening and the water opening up into an enormous lake. By now the ice had disappeared, and I began to catch a glimmer of the most amazing sight. A shimmering silver mist hung over the water. It was the most magical, the most gorgeous scene I had ever viewed. A vast lake stretched out as far as I could see. It was expansive, utterly tranquil, and stunningly beautiful. I was filled with joy. When I awoke, the message in the dream was clear. After a tough upstream battle through the challenges of grief, I had ultimately arrived at a place of great peace and joy. My new life with Ken in our new home overlooking the pond. Who knows what it makes it possible for you to fall in love with someone, and for that person to fall in love with you. Countless books have been written about this most elusive of subjects, this most sought after of all events, and yet it still remains a mystery. I call it grace. When we've been here 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we'd first begun. So I wanted to ask if any of you have any questions or comments before we stop.
That was beautiful.
I'd like to share that I think it's a big feat to write a book. I think it takes a lot to put your thoughts and feelings down to share with others. And when the material has its roots in grief, I think it's even more of a difficult endeavor, especially when you're in the middle of it and then you wonder, what have I started? Where am I going? How does this sound to me? How is it going to sound to others? When I first met Cindy, she was almost finished with her book, but she was going through it with other people, and she said, well, I just wanted to know if you would be around and be interested to read it with me sometime in the future when I get closer to the end. And I said yes. About 7 months later, I called Cindy, and Cindy said, oh, it's going fine. I'm not anywhere near ready to show it to you yet. And I said, no problem. And then one day, Cindy called me, and she said, I'm ready. And it was a most magical experience for me, a really life-changing experience for me, to not only work with a writer who was willing to put the depth of her grief and the transformation of that grief on paper as a sharing for others, but also be willing to relive again and again the hardest parts of that grief. As a miracle for me, while I knew Cindy, she had a real change in her life, and she met Ken, and that was a wonderful experience to get to know both of them. But I just wanted to say, again, as you, her friends and family, know as well as I do, a book is a difficult step. A book is a very big step, and it takes lots of time and lots of effort and sacrifice of putting lots of other things to the side and finishing what you want to say. But a book about grief and a book about transformation turned into a gift of love for other people who are grieving is a remarkable, remarkable event. And I feel honored and proud to know this woman.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I appreciate that. So, let's go back to eating and a glass of wine. I'm going to have some wine.